After King Arthur and King Pellinore and Sir Gawain had followed the mysterious hunt into the enchanted forest, they never knew at what hour of the day or of the night either they might not hear the horns of Fairyland blowing and catch a glimpse of the long string of black hounds streaming through the meadow grasses after the beautiful white stag with the silver hoofs and the horns that were like the branches of trees. Many and wonderful were the adventures that befell them, and not only them, but all the other knights of the Round Table. Sometimes the fairy hunts led them into startling danger, sometimes into strange and beautiful places, but always they found that there was a lady in distress to be rescued, a giant to be killed, a brave gentleman to be helped, or something else to be done that was included in the great vow. Well, one day Arthur was hunting with his knights on the borders of the enchanted forest, following a big stag, which was not, however, the one with the fairy hoofs that shone so brightly upon the moss. The king rode his horse far from his companions, and presently overtook the fine stag, and shot it with a strong arrow from his bow. The stag fell by the side of a river, and Arthur dismounted to see if it were quite dead. As he stood there, the dim, thrilling notes of the elfin horns came to him, and all at once, on the opposite side of the water, he caught a glimpse of the flying white deer of Fairyland, and of the shadowy speeding bodies of the coal-black hounds. Arthur's horse began to tremble. In another moment it had broken free, and was galloping home as fast as it could. It might well be frightened, for as the fairy hunt disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the whole wood went suddenly quite dark, while down the glimmering black waters of the river a little ship came sailing, with 100 torches burning in 100 silver holders, and lighting it from end to end. Nobody was steering or guiding the ship, but it sailed on as if a clever hand were at the helm, and when it reached the place where Arthur stood, it swung about on the water and lay rocking as if it were at anchor, close against the bank where the willows grew. "Now here is my adventure," said King Arthur to himself, quite joyful and fearless. "It is plain that this little ship, lit up with 100 torches, has come to take me somewhere." In his green hunting dress he strode down through the willows and boarded the ship. Off it floated again the moment he was aboard, and when he looked up at the sails above his head, he saw that they were all made of white silk, embroidered with pink roses and poppies the colour of blood. The little ship went on down the river, and the flaming torches were mirrored in the dark stream like so many stars. The king seemed to be quite alone on board, when all at once, rising up, as it seemed, from the water, 12 beautiful maidens appeared and made a ring round him, joining hands and dancing as prettily as fairies do dance on a moonlit night round anybody who is lucky enough to be able to see them. Then they all fell on their knees and said how glad they were that he had boarded the little ship, and what a beautiful feast was spread for him if he would go below. So below King Arthur went and found a cabin hung with white satin and silver candlesticks, with clear burning candles set on a table spread with fruit and honey, white bread and red wine. He sat down to eat, and the 12 beautiful maidens waited on him. When he had finished, they led him to a bedroom hung with crimson satin, and he lay down on a blue and silver bed and fell asleep. But when he awoke, the pretty ship and the blue and silver bed and the crimson satin of the hangings had all disappeared. He found himself in a dark dungeon, lying on a stone floor, with 20 other knights who were all groaning in the deepest trouble, and asking each other if nobody would ever come to help them. King Arthur sat up and rubbed his eyes. "Where am I?" he asked the knights. "And who are all of you?" "Alas, alas!" cried all the 20 at once. "We are 20 prisoners, and we have been thrown into this dungeon by the cruel lord of the castle, and here he will keep us until we die of hunger, as many have died here before us. For we can only be rescued when a knight has been found who is brave enough and strong enough to fight with the lord of the castle and to conquer him, and that nobody ever is likely to do. But indeed there is now a knight among you who is quite brave enough and strong enough to try," cried King Arthur. "Here is the adventure to which I have been brought by a little ship with silken sails and 12 dancing fairies aboard. Tell me how to get out of this dungeon, and I will soon challenge the lord of the castle to fight." Even as he said the words, a light seemed to appear from nowhere, and he saw a beautiful girl dressed like a princess standing beside him with a lamp in her hand. "Follow me," said the maiden. "I am the princess of this castle, and I want these poor prisoners saved." Immediately King Arthur sprang to his feet and followed her. She led him out of the dungeon, and all the 20 knights rose to their feet and followed, as soon as the fair lady had unlocked and opened the door. She took them all to the hall of the castle and gave King Arthur armour to wear over his green hunting clothes, and she pointed to a war horse that stood champing its bit in the courtyard outside. "Mount the horse," said she. "Take your sword, your shield, and your spear. The lord of the castle is in the meadow on his great black steed, waiting for someone to do battle with him for his prisoners. Every morning he waits, trotting up and down, but nobody ever comes. They know too well how very small is the chance they have against him." Arthur was already dressed in the bright armour and had taken up his shield and spear. But when he looked at the sword, he shook his head. "I cannot fight with that sword," he cried. "Alas, alas, where is my magic sword Excalibur?" Then the beautiful lady laughed, put her hand behind her, and brought out what looked like Arthur's own sword, Excalibur. And the king with great joy took it into his hand and set off for the meadow, with all the 20 knights pale and thin and trembling between hope and fear, walking 2 and 2 behind him. This was indeed a great adventure, much greater than King Arthur knew, for the ship was a witch's ship, and the 12 dancing fairies were wicked fairies, and the lady who called herself the princess of the castle Perilous was the wickedest fairy of them all, because you must know Morgan le Fay, Arthur's sister, had made herself queen of the water witches, and she wished her brother the king to be killed. So she had set all this magic afoot, and had also stolen Arthur's real sword Excalibur, and given it to the knight who was waiting for the king in the meadow, prancing up and down over the daisies on his great strong horse. When he saw Arthur coming, he rode towards him with a great shout, waving the stolen Excalibur round and round his head. The king spurred his own horse forward, and the two met with a ringing crash of steel. Over and over again they struck at each other, but King Arthur felt with anguish his own sword was not striking keen and true. Then even in the thick of the battle he found time to gaze at the beautiful jewels in the scabbard of the sword that his enemy used so cleverly and well, and all at once the king guessed that some terrible treachery was at work, that the other knight was fighting with the true Excalibur, and that the sword in his own hands was not even made of fighting steel. As Arthur realised this, he wavered in his saddle and almost fell. The wicked lord who fought him swung Excalibur high to strike the last blow, but at that very moment the waters of the river which flowed round the meadow were suddenly and strangely disturbed. Out of the sparkling foam sprang a figure no less sparkling and across the grass swept a beautiful lady with dripping golden hair and a long silver gown trailing behind her. It was the water fairy who had brought up Sir Lancelot, and who had heard from the moorhens and little fishes of the plot made by Morgan le Fay, and was hurrying as fast as she could to the rescue. She swept past the 20 pale knights and stood poised on her little white feet just above the grass, half resting on the meadow flowers and half hanging on her misty wings. In the air she waved her white hands and cried out magical words in a voice that was just like the bubbling of the brook. And the wicked lord on the big horse dropped Excalibur almost into Arthur's very hands. The king seized his own good sword again by its jewelled hilt, and with a shout of victory stabbed his enemy through the breast. The big knight fell heavily to the ground and lay there, as nearly dead as possible. His servants came running from the castle and took him in. He got better in the end, but nobody cared much about that. What everybody did care about was that the 20 imprisoned knights were set free, and went joyfully home to their 20 faithful wives. The Lady of the Lake slid back into her shining, bubbling river. Arthur, carrying Excalibur, galloped off to Camelot, and as for the 12 wicked fairies, and the 13th, who was the wickedest of all, no doubt they went on dancing forever on the little ship, with the 100 torches and the embroidered silken sails. They were only water fairies, you see, and they had done what the Queen of the Water Witches had ordered them to do. And after all, it had been a right noble and fine adventure for King Arthur, and as he had come out of it victorious, he had no reason to complain.